Right, good morning guys. How are you all doing? Hope you're all doing great. Today we've got a good one. I've wanted to do a video on audio mastering for a while, and it gets boring if I'm just repeatedly doing my own audio over and over and over again. I am sure you get sick of the sound of my voice. So one of the channel subscribers reached out to me recently and asked if I could do theirs, and I went, okay, sure. How about I do it on the channel as an example? And he's like, yeah, that's great. So today we have a sample from Rylan, who is making, it's kind of like an audiobook sample, like an audiobook demo. It's like 4 minutes long, so it's a little bit long for your typical demo, but sometimes that's all right for audiobooks. And we're going to get this cleaned up for him. There will be links down below to all of his stuff. I'll make sure to drop that in the description. If it's not in the description yet, Rylan, email me. My email's down there, and I will update all the details. Right, so let's take a look at what he sent to me and what we can do with it. So this is apparently a Dr. Dolittle sample. Straight off the bat,
answered the cat's meat man. It's
looking good. We've got a little bit of room tone at the beginning. That's a fantastic habit to get into. Give us a bit of room tone at the beginning and the end of the track. Allows us to use it not just for noise reduction, but also a clean bit of room tones handy for some editing techniques if we're cutting breaths and want to paste in room tone rather than silence, so it doesn't sound like a gate. You'll see how I do that in a minute. I do it a little bit differently. The editors we have at Kraken Media in the studio, what they tend to do is open it into a multi-track project, and then instead of doing hard edits, they'll crossfade it. I like to expand things down until everything's nice and soft, and then instead of editing in room tone, I'll cut either side of a breath, and then that should hopefully leave the right gap. We'll come to that in a minute. So first thing we've got here, let's have a look at the file spec, right? So we've got 44.1K, which is absolutely great. 16-bit, absolutely fine. WAV, which is the very important bit. 16-bit could be 24 on a spoken word thing like this. Probably not going to lose too much, but stereo, we don't need stereo. So the first thing we're going to do is convert this to mono. There's different ways of doing this. We can extract mono files from source. So we have, it'll take the left channel from the stereo and the right channel from the stereo and make them their own files, and then we can use one of them. Or we can do it with convert sample type, which is what we're going to do here. Just change this to mono. Okay, boom. Now we are working with a mono file. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar, I'm using Audition. This top bit is your typical waveform, right? This is just an amplitude, a measure of amplitude, how loud it is at any point. This funny multicolored thing at the bottom is called a spectrogram. And what this does is it shows you the amplitude by color. So the redder it is, the louder it is, the darker it is, the quieter it is. And then over here, you can see 500, 1K, 2K, 5K, 10K. That is the frequency. So this is giving you a visual representation of what frequencies are where. And I find this a particularly helpful tool when mastering, because you can see here, there's a lot of build up here. So this is probably an S sound, maybe. Right? And if you get a lot of build up in the bottoms, you can see the rumble. And so this is a very useful way of looking at things to be able to see what it is you're doing. And if you have particularly dark parts, then you know that maybe that frequency needs lifting up. And if you have particularly bright parts, maybe you need to do something about that. For example, this bit here is a bit sus. Yeah, see? So we'll come back. We'll probably run a bit of a de-esser to try and soften those S's down a bit. Right. So what are we going to do? And what's the process for getting this mastered and getting it sounding its best? So there's no right or wrong way of doing this. This is my way of doing it. Other people might do this roughly in a similar way, but differently. And what I'm going to do is just run through and go over the general principles of each step and what we're trying to do. As I said, you can have arguments in the comments about whether you should EQ or compress first. For me, there's no hard and fast rule because one audio track might need something doing that another one doesn't. So you just sort of have to try it out and see what works best and what's best for this particular thing you're working on. But let's have a look, shall we? So first thing I'm seeing here is there's quite a lot of high peaks. We've got a nice consistent volume throughout, and then a couple of high high peaks. So the first thing I'm just going to do, just to tidy this up a little bit, I'm going to run a compressor at, I think, about negative 12 dB. Amplitude and compression dynamics. And what did we say? About 12 dB. So, and I'm just going to cut this down by maybe 2.5 is probably about right. And now if I plop this on, it should just take those down. Brilliant. And that's just sort of got rid of the random anomalies, because most of the track's not that loud, so we're just going to take that out. Next up, I'm going to normalize this to negative 1 dB. And here, this is what we're working with. Now, generally the first thing we want to do is deal with noise reduction, because if we take out the noise now, that will make our life a lot easier down the road. We don't want to be doing compression with noise, because then we have to remove the noise afterwards, and it's just tricky. First step, noise. Once you've normalized anyway, first step, noise reduction. Again, this is very much a less is more approach. Everything we take out from noise, we're going to take out from the voice as well. Now, I don't know if you guys will be able to hear that on YouTube, but if I boost this by 15 decibels, this is the noise that's throughout the track. Now, if I check the amp stats on this, this is negative 53.29, and for ACX, you need it to be at negative 60 or lower. This, though, honestly...
The Story of Dr. Dolittle by Hugh Lofting.
Signal to noise ratio, which is how much noise there is versus volume of the voice, the ratio between them, is very good. This is quite a low noise floor compared to the voice. It's not amazing by any standard, but it's good. It's a very good starting point that we can work with. So the first thing we're going to do is noise reduction. For that, I'm going to use Restoration RX. Isotope RX, right? Voice denoise, here we go. Right. So I'm just going to set the threshold to 0, and I'm going to set this to about 10. And just from experience using this tool, I know that's about right, and it's not going to do anything too crazy. You don't want it to start chopping away at the quality of the voice. You want it to be clean, but you want the voice to be there. You want the presence to be there. And the more you reduce the noise, the thinner the voice sounds. And it's better to have a little bit of noise and have a really rich, warm voice than to have a perfectly surgical sounding recording, at least in my opinion. You can forgive a little bit of noise if it sounds really good, but there's nothing worse than listening to a fishbowl sounding recording because everything's been stripped from it. So let's give that a go. So you can see the input and output levels here. This is my effects rack here. So the raw audio is coming into this rack, going through the denoise, and then the output is down here. So you can see it's taking out a considerable amount of noise.
The Story of Dr. Dolittle.
So that's with it on.
The Story of Dr. Dolittle.
Okay, so we are dealing with a lot of the noise. It's still there. I can still hear it. You might not on YouTube. But we haven't lost any quality in the voice. So I'm very happy with that setup for the minute. We might circle back and adjust that later if we need to. What I'm going to try and do is stack everything up in the effects rack so you can see the whole process rather than doing it one by one. So the next step is, for this, is going to be EQ. Now I'm going to use Neutron for this. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw what's called a transient shaper on it. A transient shaper is kind of like a fancy compressor. The transients are the points of the sound. So if you have a sound effect that goes boing, the transient is the loudest part. And what a transient shaper does is just gently massages down the loudest part of a sound. And we're using a transient shaper rather than a compressor because a compressor attacks everything over a certain threshold, and a limiter just cuts everything off. So we want to keep the dynamics, we want to keep the shape, but we just want to sort of mold it down. And that's what a transient shaper will do. And it's going to be difficult to get all this on one screen.
Dolittle.
I'm so used to using two screens. Right?
Excerpt read by E.M.Y.
Okay, so this section's quite good. I'm just going to put it on loop so we can just listen to this section over and over again.
The doctor was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor.
So at the minute it's
was
not
sitting
doing
in his kitchen.
So what we're going to do is bring the threshold down.
Talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him.
A little bit less.
Him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man.
It's just smoothing everything out.
The doctor was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor, was.
We're going to need a tiny bit more. Ooh, went up.
Sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man,
That's all right.
who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the.
Let's try 2. Let's see how 2 sounds.
Doctor was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with
I'm liking that. That's working. Right. Let's see what the EQ's doing. Before we do anything crazy with the EQ, I am just going to set this up with the basic shape that you use for an equalizer. So we're going to roll off the lows. Nothing too crazy.
Cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat.
Okay. Then we're going to boost the lows a little bit. Widen that out.
Meat man, who had come to.
We boost the lows slightly just because it gives the voice a bit of body to it.
See him with.
The issue with this though is if you boost the lows too much, you're not making the voice sound deeper. We're not changing the pitch, we're boosting the low frequencies. Because we're cutting the very low frequencies, we're putting some back into this area, and the idea is if we lift up either end of the voice, it sort of evens out.
The doctor was sitting in his kitchen.
That's why it's called an equalizer.
Kitchen talking with.
But if we bump the lows, it'll quite often give it a little bit of richness and a little bit of warmth. If we go over the top with it,
meat man, who had come to see him with.
It just sounds thick and muddy and horrible.
The doctor.
Nice gentle
was
lift.
Sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man.
Try it off.
Who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the.
Yeah, very subtle difference. Okay. The next thing we want to do is there's normally a muddy frequency around the 3, 4, 500 mark. So we're going to try and find this. And the way we're going to find the right point is we're going to boost it up, listen, and then take it down.
The doctor was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen.
Okay, so in this voice, with this recording, with this setup, it seems like about 400 is the... Oh no! Go away! Give me back. There we go. About 400. So what we're going to do is we're just going to dip a couple of decibels out of the 400 range.
And talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man.
There we go, and that's on. And you see it's just a little bit clearer now, a little bit more presence.
Who had come to see.
Now I'm looking at this graph, and I'm noticing there's a bit of a dip off with this microphone at around the 300 range, and there's sort of some weird stuff happening just under the 3000 range. So I'm going to try just giving it a little shelf that starts about there, just to lift the top end up a bit. But this recording's already quite crisp.
Kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen. Talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him.
Yeah, I like that. I think that works.
With the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him.
And this is on.
And with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man.
Might just give it a tiny little nudge, a little bit more.
Who had come to see him with the doctor, was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come to see him with the doctor. Was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man, who had come.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm liking that. Right. Next up.
At the rain and singing a sailor song to herself.
Yeah, we're going to need some de-essing. We'll come back to that, though. For the minute, what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw on a new tool, and this one is going to be RX8 declick. And what this does is it removes clicky sounds, but there is a preset in here for mouth noise, multiband. And what's cool about this plugin is I can reverse it and output just what it's removing. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So we're going to remove all that grossness.
And started to listen. You see, Doctor, the cat's meat man went on. You know all about animals.
We're just going to make sure, keep an eye on things as we go and make sure it doesn't start doing anything really weird, right? So, that's good. That's dialed in.
Give this.
Now, let's have a look at amplitude stats. We are going to need to compress this because we've got, just compare that bit with that bit. There's a big difference, not a big difference, but there is a difference and we need to level everything out a bit. So let's just have a look how far off we are. So at the minute we are at negative 21.93 decibels on the RMS. We need it to be 18 to 23 for ACX. This, though, needs to be -3. So if we take 3 decibels out of it, then scan it again, minus 24.9. So we only need to compress enough to get the average RMS up by, 3 or 4 decibels to get it really in there. So let me just undo that and undo that. Go back to our effects rack. I quite often like using multiband compressors, but let's just keep it simple and we'll go with the standard compressor. So let's have a look at our waveform and see what it's telling us. So the bulk of our audio, the bulk of this track looks like it's around 12 to 15 dBs. 9 to 6 decibels, there's still a good amount in there. And then between 6 to 1 decibels, there's not a lot going on in this top bit at all. So I think what we'll do is we'll go for about 15. Because we want to chop that down. Maybe we're going to go 20. Because we still want to keep some of the dynamics, obviously. We'll try 20 at 2. And I'm just going to bring up the preview, and it's going to just show us what it looks like. Yep, that's about right. But more importantly, it's got to sound right.
They think, and listen, you can make a lot of money doctoring animals. Do you know that? You see?
Okay, so what I'm going to do now, just to help us along, is we're going to put a limiter on at negative 3.1. Come on, play with me. There we go. And I've explained this before, I think, one of my previous videos. The limit is -3, but there's always a little bit of margin of error with different softwares and the way they interpret things and other weird and wacky stuff happening. So we're going to go 3.1, just so there's a 0.1 dB room for error. It saves a lot of headaches. There is nothing worse than getting something rejected and sent back to you because the peak value is 2.99. Honestly, just go 3.1. So we're going to add in some makeup gain. So I'm looking at the input and the output.
Animals, much more than what these...
And I'm adding in makeup gain until we get the right sort of volume.
The parrot.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the loudest part, or one of the loudest parts.
That book you wrote about cats. Why, it's wonderful.
And just make sure that we're not hitting the limiter with it.
I can't read or write myself, or maybe I'd write some books.
That's looking really good.
Hear this.
I can see the levels are coming up to where I want them to. And it's not hitting the limiter. The limiter's there as a safety net, by the way, at this point. It's not there to actually do anything. It's just there in case there's like one random bit that's going crazy. But there we go. That's that. So now we've compressed it. We need to come back to de-esser, as I've mentioned.
6C.
For this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a tool by, I think it's Waves Audio. Sibilance Mono. I'm just going to use the voiceover preset because this thing is awesome.
Oh, no, said the doctor quickly. You mustn't do that. That wouldn't be right. Oh, I didn't mean real sick, answered the cat's meat man. Just a little something to make them droopy like was what I had reference to.
Nice. Okay, I think that works quite well. Let's go find one of the really bad SE bits, this bit.
She's a scholar, she is.
So that's with it, and this is without it.
She's a scholar, she is.
Oh, yeah, you can hear how much that's working.
She's a scholar, she is.
There we go, lovely. It's just taken the real harshness, because that S coming through, especially things we've boosted the highs in the EQ or boosted the frequencies that they're in a little bit, it really rattles the skull. So
she's a scholar, she is.
That's really taken out. And the way it works is it's not an EQ, it's a compressor. And so it's working as a compressor, but only in the band that the S sound is in, which is typically between like the 4 and 8K range. So now with DS, let's clean it up a little bit and throw on an expander. So I know where we are. We're going to go 1.8 at negative 35, and I reckon that will work really well.
The Story of Dr. Dolittle by Hugh Lofting.
It's broken.
The Story of Dr. Dolittle by Hugh Lofting. Excerpt read.
And here's the challenge with the expander, right? I want it to be quiet. I want it to handle the really slight breaths like this one. So this is without the expander. Right? And then put the expander on. The breath is still there. It's still very present, but it's just it's not as present. It's sort of pushed into the background, right? So we still have the character of the recording. We still have the character of the voice and the personality. It's just a little bit less distracting. And what I'm going to do now to make sure this works, I'm just going to play a bit, close my eyes and listen, and see.
The Story of Dr.
I'm going to see if I can hear the expander open and close.
Dr. Dolittle by Hugh Lofting. Excerpt read by E.M. Wild. It happened one day that the doctor was sitting in his kitchen talking with the cat's meat man who had come to see him.
I know it's there because I know it's there, but if I didn't know it's there, I'd have a very tough time telling you whether it was there or not. Even on the quiet breaths, I can't hear it getting choppy, so I'm very happy with that. 35 at 1.8 is absolutely perfect. So we've smashed that out, we've smashed that out, we've got the de-esser on. Is there anything else that I'd want to do with this? I'm just going to save this quickly as test master.
Excerpt read by E.M. Wild. It happened one day that the doctor was sitting.
There is a tiny, tiny little bit of reverb on there. I'm just going to experiment and see, doesn't always work, doesn't always help, if a tiny little touch of de-reverb, maybe 20%.
Why don't you give up being a people's doctor and be an animal?
There we go. Now that's the danger of using denoise and de-reverb tools. I don't know if you guys heard that, it was subtle. Right, listen to this.
Why don't you give up being a people's doctor?
Did you hear that? Drop in the comments now if you picked up on that. Did you hear that little squeak in there? I'll play it again. Listen for the little squeak.
Why don't you give up being a people's doctor?
That is from the de-reverb tool. Now, if you really need to use the de-reverb tool, you can get around that by turning off the auto gain, because it's the auto gain that freaks it out. But if you turn off the auto gain, you realize how much the reverb tool crushes your audio.
Why don't you give up being a people's doctor?
In fact, turning it off hasn't fixed it in this occasion, so we're going to abandon that idea altogether and remove that.
Why don't you give up being a people's doctor and be an animal doctor? Asked the cat's meat man. The parrot, Polynesia, was sitting in the window looking out at the rain and...
All in all, I'm quite happy with this so far. I don't want to fiddle with things too much. Like I said, I'm a big fan of less is more. I will just have one quick experiment just to see if a tiny bit of denoise might just add that extra little bit.
Why don't you give up being a people's doctor and be an animal doctor? Asked the cat's meat man.
Nah, it's not doing it for me.
Why don't you give up being a people's doctor and be an animal doctor?
Yeah, see, we've got to the point now where, I don't know if you heard it when we had the denoise on there as well, where it's starting to... When we add things, it's becoming detrimental.
being a people's doctor and be an animal doctor.
So that's most of what we need to do. So next step, we're going to apply this. There we go.
You might have been a cat yourself.
And this is what we got. We've got a nice even colour throughout our spectrogram, which is
Money
nice.
doctoring animals. Do you know that? You see, I'd say the story of Dr. Dolittle.
Oh yeah, that's nice. And then what I'm going to do is I'm trying to refrain from using my shortcut keys. I'm going to use, we're going to normalize it to -3. All right. And then we're going to just check the stats. So we got -3.01. And the RMS is 20.69. Absolutely spot on. Now, this still needs editing, but if I do that, this video is going to end up being about 6 weeks long, so I'm going to stop it there. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it helped. This is a very, very, very basic, overarching guide. Not even a guide, just an example of how to master something and clean something up. And we've arrived at something that's nice and clean and natural sounding.
The Story of Dr. Dolittle by Hugh Lofting.
Because it's very, very easy.
Excerpt read.
To overcook it and start getting to the point where it's getting detrimental. So this is why I'm happy with this one. I'll send it over to Rylan. We'll see what he thinks. Let me know what you think in the comments. I will go over what I want to do. What I plan on doing is making a video about each one of these tools individually and going into them in depth. So let me know in the comments which one you want to see first. Until next time, guys, make sure you subscribe so you get the next video. Peace out. Take care.